I grew up in a small city in the northern United States. Growing up in such a rural part of the country certainly made for an interesting childhood. I often spent my youth outdoors, walking along dirt roads and playing in the woods near our house. Those memories I have from my childhood must have made an impression on me, as once I was old enough to move out of my family's house, I decided to get a place of my very own, in this very town. All of my friends whom I grew up with moved away from the town for college or job opportunities elsewhere. I, on the other hand, had gotten a job working in a small department store in the center of our city. I started working there during high school, and after a few years had worked myself up to management. Working through high school gave me an opportunity to save up enough money to buy a house in town. The selection of homes wasn't that fast, as not many people were in the market to sell. However, there were a couple that were well within my budget. After getting approved, I began my life as a home-owning member of society. One of the major cons to living up north is the weather. The unpredictable weather was a constant, especially in the colder months. I'm sure some of you who happen to live in the north would agree that the weather is terrible. One minute it would be clear sunny skies, then the next is like a typhoon had settled on top of us. Over the years, I've seen my fair share of bad weather, but this year had been particularly brutal for our area. It started in early October, the first signs of what was to come. I had awoken one morning to find that the ground was lightly covered by a stark white blanket of snow. Even though it was quite early for snow, it wasn't unexpected. The temperature had been dropping consistently throughout September, so I assumed it was only a matter of time. As the days passed by, the snow became heavier and heavier. It seemed like every day, another inch was added to the already growing mountain of snow that covered the city. Halfway through November, it happened. Our town was utterly encapsulated by the icy grips of Mother Nature. Luckily, I had the foresight to stock up on supplies in the event of being snowed in. I had awoken one morning about a week ago. The dull gray sky almost convinced me that night hadn't quite left yet, but my clock, which read 9 a.m., begged to differ. I walked over to my bedroom window, which lightly rattled against the wailing gusts of wind outside. I found myself silently thanking that window for keeping the frigid air away from me. As I peeled back the curtain and tried my best to look outside, I found it nearly impossible. The snow was already covering the lower half of the window itself. The rest of the glass was frosted over, which made seeing through difficult. The flurry of crystallized water seemed to swirl in a violent torrent outside. I tightened my robe around me and instinctively rubbed my arms. I wasn't cold at that moment, but just seeing the outside was enough to send shivers throughout my body. As I got ready for the day, I called my boss and told him about my situation. He expressed that the majority of the people in town were having the same issue. He said, unfortunately, that work would be closed until the weather improved. I couldn't help but grin at the word unfortunate. He then said he'd contact me once the weather had cleared up. Before I could hang up, my phone crackled a bit and the call had been dropped, probably due to the bad weather outside. I made a pot of coffee and stared out of my large window in the living room. Despite the hours passing by, the weather was relentless. It was almost as if our town had angered nature in some way. As I stared through the glass, absent-mindedly in awe of such a spectacle, I thought I saw something in the blizzard. It was only for a brief moment, but had been consumed by the wall of snow. I thought it might have been an animal, searching for shelter to wait out the storm. Just the thought of being outside in this weather was disheartening. The day went on, and I spent most of my time doing chores I had been neglecting up until I had nothing else to do. Then, once most of my house had been cleaned, I began watching some of my favorite movies to pass the time. I'd occasionally get up and give a passing glance to the window to see if there had been any break in the storm. There hadn't been, so with a sigh, I'd grab a snack and resume my movie marathon. That night, I found little rest as the wind outside produced a constant high-pitched shriek. It sounded like a banshee wailing outside my window. Despite the noise, I managed to drown it out with a pillow pressed tightly over my ears. The next morning was just as gloomy as the last. The sun was once again nowhere to be found, giving off this joyless atmosphere. The winds raged outside, and I was no longer in awe of nature. I was now just praying for its end. I made my way out into my kitchen and made a cup of coffee. As I sipped, I looked towards my window again. The snow had risen another couple of inches. I could feel myself growing more and more worried. In all my years living in this town, there hadn't been a blizzard as bad as this before. Watching the swirling haze outside was mesmerizing. As I stared, a break occurred in the snowfall, and for a second, I thought I saw someone standing outside in the snow. It looked almost like that figure I saw before. It was just a gray silhouette, being buffeted by the snow around it. As quickly as it had appeared, it vanished, consumed by the weather outside. I thought my eyes were still in the process of waking up, as the thought of someone simply standing outside in that weather wasn't likely. I tried to forget about what I thought I saw, and went on with my day. That night, as I was lying in bed trying to fall asleep, I heard a noise coming from my living room. At first I wasn't sure, but then it sounded again. It sounded like knocking on my front door. That was impossible, I thought. There was no way someone would be outside in this. I glanced over at my clock. 11 p.m. and dull red numbers glowed back at me. I sat up in bed, wondering if I would hear the noise again. 3 more thumps echoed from my living room, down my hallway, and into my bedroom. I could feel unease growing in the pit of my stomach. I got out of bed, put on my robe, and stepped out into my living room. I tried to explain the sounds I had heard as something being battered against my door by the wind, but something inside me knew that wasn't the case. I walked over to my door and tried to peek through the 3 glass windows that were set above it. Looking around, all I could see was a mix of black and white. There was no indication of anyone outside my door. Feeling a bit of relief, I thought my previous assumption had been confirmed. Just as I was making my way back to bed, I heard another knock, but this time it didn't come from my front door. The familiar sound of something hitting glass was apparent. I slowly turned towards my large glass window in the living room. Between the lightless sky and the frosted glass, it was difficult to see anything outside. I found myself being slowly drawn to it, curious as to see what was now hitting my window. I was within 5 feet from the glass. I squinted but was unable to see anything of note. I could feel a sigh on the verge of leaving my lungs when a hand pressed against the glass. This bluish-white hand that struck the glass made me yelp as I took a step back. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Someone was standing outside my window, in this blizzard. Unsurprisingly, my first instinct was that someone was in desperate need of help. Being stuck out in this weather would surely be a death sentence. I was about to turn and make my way to my door to see if I could aid them, but before I did, I saw something else. A face seemed to fade into view, like stepping into a light from the shadows. It was nearly pressed against the glass. It didn't seem possible. The chalky skin contrasted against the dark background. Bits of its face seemed to be rotting away. Blackened streaks of torn flesh that seemed reminiscent of frostbite. Half of its lower jaw was exposed. The bones seemed to be encased in frosted blood. What was disturbing me the most was that, overall, its expression seemed calm, like it was someone just patiently waiting. But its eyes, they betrayed the rest of its demeanor. Its eyes were filled with rage, jealousy, and pain. It stared at me with unflinching precision, like it wanted nothing more than to see me dead. Then, after a few painstaking seconds of staring, the face faded from view, and another moment later, the hand did as well. Despite its sudden departure, I know that it hasn't gone far. It's still out there, searching for a way to get inside, searching for a way to get to me. It's been a few days since seeing that thing outside. I have taken some measures in securing my home. I've barricaded my doors and windows as best I can. I've tried contacting the police, but the bad weather outside made service non-existent. It's not as if they could even get to me if I could call them. Every night it seems there's a new knock on a different window or door in my house, as if that thing is testing my home to find a way inside. I'm just praying this storm lets up soon, because if it doesn't, and whatever that thing is breaks inside, I won't have anywhere else to run. As a kid, I used to love playing games. I'm not talking about video games, although I did enjoy those too. I'm referring to games you play with friends. Games such as tag, capture the flag, red light, green light. But my all-time favorite game to play growing up was hide and seek. My love for the game was probably due to the fact that I was the best hider in the neighborhood. I can't tell you how many times I've heard, "We give up," or "Ollie Ollie oxen free." Although I was great at melding into the shadows, my seeking skills had a lot to be desired. Oblivious is probably the easiest way to put it. One of my friends could be sticking halfway out of a bush and I'd completely miss him. That was probably what kept my friends interested in the game. They knew if I'd be seeking, they'd have a chance at winning. Almost every single day, my friends and I would get together and roam around looking for places to play. We'd often choose one of our houses and play there, but our parents were the type to tell us to just go play outside. Because of this, we'd often find various places nearby to play and hang out. Within walking distance, there were a few local parks which became our go-to locations. Each park had their own pros and cons, but both were fairly good in their own right. There were a couple of vacant lots which contained various piles of junk with which to utilize. There was even a construction yard that seemed to be perpetually vacant. We played there a few times but stopped after the police caught us and told us to leave. The reason I'm telling you all of this is so I can tell you about the last time I ever played hide and seek. It was a chilly autumn day in my town. We had already been let out from school for our winter break. Despite the ever-increasing cold weather, that did little to deter us as we still got together almost every day and hung out. It was a Friday when there was a knock on my door, asking my mother if I was home, as if I'd be anywhere else. My mom called me to the door and standing there was Chris, Mark, and Justin. Chris asked if I was down to play a little hide and seek, and of course the answer was yes. But there was something about how he was asking that seemed to indicate that he had something else up his sleeve. Curious, I asked him as I was grabbing my jacket where we'd be playing. He flashed a large grin across his face and told me it wasn't far. Not one to pass up a new and exciting adventure, I followed the group and we all began walking. We walked along the frosted sidewalk, not paying any mind to the wind biting at our faces. As we left the confines of our neighborhood, I was growing more and more unsure as we had never gone in this direction before. During our trek, we all joked and chatted about various things going on, and it wasn't much longer until I saw exactly where we were heading to. Fading into view on the horizon was what appeared to be a collection of houses, each sporting an identical pale white exterior. I asked Chris if that was the place, and he simply returned a silent nod. I gave him a confused glance as playing hide and seek in a stranger's house wasn't something I was interested in doing. I looked to the others for confirmation and they just continued on chatting, paying me little mind. Once we were within a few yards of the house, I saw a large sign fixed near the road. The sign read, "Timeless Model Homes. We bring the homes, you bring the family." Below the slogan was a date that read, "Coming soon this spring." As I eyed the advertisement, Mark gave me a playful shove and we all continued. Although the houses looked finished on the outside, Chris called me over to a window and I looked inside. The interiors were still just bare bones. Right away, I could already see various hiding spots lying in wait, ready to be used at a moment's notice. Chris walked over to the door and gave the knob a slight twist. Surprisingly, it had been left unlocked. I suppose there wasn't a whole lot to steal from a bare-bones shell of a house. We all walked inside and examined our surroundings. There was no heat inside, so the temperature remained mostly the same. At least the wind wasn't blowing on us, I thought. Chris gathered us together and said that he'd be the first to seek. I asked what the boundaries were, because there were always boundaries. We had to have some way of keeping people from running off into the woods never to be found by the seekers. Chris thought for a moment. He seemed to weigh the options of making the game challenging but fair. He then looked up with a grin. He said that these 3 houses, and then gestured out of the window to the other 2 houses in this particular lot, were all fair game. There were many more houses all around us, but 3 seemed reasonable, especially for such a small group of people. He said he would stand in the street and count to 100 before searching. The rest of us looked to one another and nodded. We followed Chris out into the street. He took a few more steps ahead of us before bringing his hands up to his eyes. Methodically, he spoke aloud, making sure to enunciate each number clearly. From the moment he started, the 3 of us remaining scattered. I turned to see Mark walk into the house directly behind us. Justin jogged over to the one adjacent to it. They both disappeared into the darkened front doors, leaving me to choose the 3rd house. Now, there was no rule that said I couldn't choose one of the previous houses, but figured why not make it a tad more challenging. I could already hear Chris entering the 20s. I quickly dashed over and opened the door. Stepping inside the house, I immediately noticed that this layout was different from the one we had entered before. I tried my best to get a grasp on the layout, but the low light inside the house, despite the multiple windows, made seeing difficult. I ran up the stairs and searched the vacant bedrooms for any decent spots. A couple of them had closets, but without doors would be easy spots to search. I ran back down the stairs and looked around. At the far end of the house was a door which seemed to be in what would be the kitchen. I walked over to it and pulled it open. Before me was a set of steps that descended down into a pitch-black void. It was probably a basement or a cellar, I thought. I quickly walked down the steps, squinting as I tried to see the path in front of me. At the base of the steps, there was no light. I had no clue what was near me or how big this area was. I rounded the stairs and decided I'd just hide underneath them to be safe. As I slowly walked around, my legs bumped into various objects. I assumed they were extra construction supplies, wood and metal and the like. After a few moments, I found the wall behind the stairs. I could feel random materials all around me, so I tried my best to crouch in between the large piles. Then I waited. And waited. After a while, I was beginning to wonder if Chris was even looking for me. I was beginning to feel my leg cramp up and was about to get up and leave when I heard a noise. I quickly covered my mouth because I thought Chris had finally made his way over to me. The basement door opened and for a second, nothing happened. I thought Chris would at least call out to me, but he didn't. Then I heard something start descending the steps. The footsteps were heavy, and the floorboards strained underneath the weight. Chris wasn't a large kid. He was actually quite skinny, so I didn't know who this was. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs. Then the sounds completely stopped. I wasn't sure of what to do. Since I was behind the stairs, I couldn't see who it was, and with the extremely faint light shining from the kitchen area, probably through a window. It did little to illuminate my surroundings. Then I heard a voice. One that didn't belong to any of my friends. It was a deep and raspy voice that grated on my eardrums. It said, "I can see you." When I heard this, my eyes went wide. If I hadn't already been covering my mouth, I might have screamed. There was no way this person could see me. I thought I had chosen a good hiding spot. And besides, I couldn't even see him with it being so dark. Regardless, I had no idea who was in this basement with me, and that was a problem. Then, out of nowhere, a hand grabbed onto my arm, covering my mouth. The grip was immense and nearly ripped my arm from my body. When this happened, I screamed and flailed with all my might. My kicking legs bumped into the piles of stuff around us, and after a few seconds, the piles gave way. After the clattering of wood and the clanging of metal subsided, I realized I had been freed from his grasp. I quickly dashed forward and rounded the stairs. As I was sprinting up them, I felt something grip my leg and I fell forward onto my face. I turned, and I saw the face of my attacker. What I once thought was a man wasn't. Its eyes were like tiny pinpoints of light staring at me. It had no nose on its face, which gave its shape a smooth appearance. Then its mouth opened. Like splitting a watermelon horizontally in half, its head opened up, revealing sharpened teeth that extended all the way down its throat. I screamed so loud that I nearly passed out. Its hand started to drag me back into the basement, and I frantically searched for anything to grab onto. I gripped the doorframe and pulled with all my might, swinging my free leg around wildly. With a lucky kick to its face, the grip on my leg loosened and I threw myself out of the basement, running out of that house at top speed. As I darted out into the front yard, I found my parents standing out there with my friends, as well as their parents too. They were also accompanied by 2 police officers. When my mom saw me, she shouted my name before running over and embracing me. I asked her what she was doing here, and she explained that Chris told them that we were all playing hide and seek here, but that they couldn't find me at all, even after calling my name repeatedly, for 3 hours. So they went home and told their parents. My mom contacted the police to come search for me, but by that point I couldn't stop my tears from streaming down my face. She asked me where I was, and I pointed to the house behind me. I told her I was hiding in the basement. My mother then returned a confused look at me. What she said next made no sense to me whatsoever. She said that the police had searched all of the houses, including the one I just came out of, and there was no basement in any of them. I don't know what happened that day. I don't know where that basement came from. And I definitely don't know what that thing was that attacked me. But ever since that day, I never went into another basement. And I never, ever played another game of hide and seek again. In the early 1970s, a scientific research team ventured deep into the wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. Their mission was simply to catalog and observe various flora and fauna of the region, to better understand how adaptive changes affected the ecosystem. The team was comprised of 6 members, each specializing in different fields. The head of the expedition was a zoologist by the name of Nathan Matthews. He was an older man in his early 50s. All records leading up to the excursion indicated that he was a man of few words, but well respected in his own right. Cheryl Helcom was the senior botanist on the team. According to records, she was well liked by her peers and was quite charismatic. Don Rhodes was the assistant botanist to Cheryl. Unfortunately, not a whole lot of information was recovered regarding the man. Frank Garrett was a park ranger who had been tasked with assisting the team in locating research sites. His primary job was to provide security, more so dealing with the plethora of dangerous wildlife in the area. A biologist by the name of Randall Haynes is next in line. According to past reports, it would seem in his spare time, Randall liked to gamble quite a bit. When he wasn't in a lab or in the field, you'd most likely find him crowding a blackjack table, or so it was described. Finally, the last member of the research team was a young woman by the name of Debbie Andrews. She was the team's entomologist. Much like Don Rhodes, there wasn't a whole lot of history regarding her. There were a few excerpts that led investigators to believe she was relatively new in the field, possibly a college student or newly graduated. The reason there is relatively little information regarding the researchers was that they all came from different locations across the country. Investigators tried to dig deeper into their pasts, but could only get some decent information on half of them. In the summer of 1972, the team ventured into the woods and were never seen again. After a number of weeks had passed, the only person to notify the authorities regarding the matter was one of Frank's associates, who also happened to be a park ranger. Apparently, there had been no scientific excursions orchestrated during that time. The other scientists who happened to work in those fields, and even a few who knew some of the members of the team, stated that it wasn't something that had been tasked from a third party. Well, as far as they knew. Most had assumed that the lead, Dr. Matthews, wanted to conduct a research expedition on his own, and gathered up some of the other interested parties to join him. The search for the missing team lasted for 4 months. Despite their best efforts in locating any sign of the team, they came up empty-handed. However, during the final month of searching, they did find something of interest. There was what seemed to be a journal that had been shoved into a hole of a tree. This find prompted another 3 weeks of search in that area, before the case had been ultimately closed. While the overall situation seemed chilling and mysterious in its own right, the contents of that journal proved to be even more disturbing. Through some means I won't get into, I had acquired a copy of the journal. It should be noted that it isn't clear who exactly wrote the journal, but I think it had been penned by Dr. Matthews. Also, due to weathering, some of the pages had been damaged beyond comprehension. I'm not sure why I feel so compelled to transcribe this. Maybe I just want them not to be lost to time. Maybe it's just sheer morbid fascination in the story. Maybe it's both. Either way, I will do my best to lay out the contents of the journal. July 17th, 1972. I had always been aware of the vastness of nature in this part of the country, but to actually stand before it, it's safe to say I have been humbled by its magnitude. The others seem just as eager as myself to head on in, but I must maintain my bearing, not just for the others' sake, but for myself as well. July 19th, 1972. So far, most of our expedition has only been travel. When you're traveling in a group, time seems to slip away. Unfortunately, we haven't even made it to our first site, so aside from some passive observation, nothing has truly gotten done. Still, I'm hopeful that our efforts will be rewarded tenfold. July 20th, 1972. We've made it to our first site. Good thing too, because I think Don was about to lose it if we had to trek for another day. His high spirits seem to have returned though. Not just him, but this was a much needed morale boost for the entire team. July 25th, 1972. We found some isolated micro-ecosystems in certain areas. More research needed to be sure, but this was an incredible find. Frank has been on edge since last night. Apparently something had stirred him from his sleep and he has been agitated ever since. I'm going to keep an eye on him. July 27th, 1972. Something odd had occurred last night. We were all woken up at roughly midnight to the sounds of Frank shouting into the woods. Upon exiting our tents to inquire, Frank pointed out between the trees. None of us were able to see what he was pointing at, mainly due to the lack of light in the area. After a while, we managed to calm Frank down. We asked him what he saw, and he said there was a person walking around in the woods. July 28th, 1972. Frank has calmed down a bit. Not very reassuring to have our ranger lose his head, that's to be sure. Hopefully he'll be able to regain his composure, at least enough to lead us to our next destination. July 30th, 1972. Something happened. Debbie Andrews had gotten separated from the group during our travels. We've spent the day searching for her, but we're unable to track her down. We're still heading to site number 2. Once we get there and set up camp, we'll be able to perform a more thorough search. July 31st, 1972. We had made it to Site 2 and found something inexplicable. Debbie had arrived before us, though that didn't seem possible. As we approached her, we discovered something was wrong. Debbie Andrews was dead. What was even stranger was that her body seemed to be decaying at an astonishing rate. Parts of her body seemed to be turning to ash and crumbling away. We had no idea what caused this, so we're going to have a discussion on what to do next. August 1st, 1972. We decided it would be best to cut our excursion short for the sake of safety. However, sometime during the night, Frank had gone missing. When we all left our tents, we found Frank's to be vacant. After calling his name for a few hours, it was apparent that he wasn't nearby. Much to the others' dismay, I made the decision to start our journey back. August 2nd, 1972. During our walk through the forest, I thought I saw someone walking through the trees adjacent to us. It was difficult to see, but I'm sure of it. What's more was that they appeared to be wearing a black cloak or dress of some kind. After passing by some trees and looking again, the figure seemingly had vanished. Something strange is happening. August 5th, 1972. Half of our remaining party has gone missing. I'm at a loss for words. We had been steadily camping and moving over the past few days. But last night, 2 more of our members had mysteriously vanished. It's just myself and Randall now. He seems visibly shaken at the recent events. I've tried my best to reassure him, though I'm not sure I can convince myself, let alone another person. We have to make it back. We must make it back. August 6th, 1972. I saw it last night. I haven't slept much since the events started, and upon losing the majority of the team, sleep seems like a distant memory. I heard rustling outside of my tent at roughly 1 in the morning. I quietly peeked my head out to look around. I saw Randall standing outside his tent, but he wasn't alone. That same shadowy figure was standing right next to him. It raised a hand and rested it upon Randall's shoulder. I'm not sure, but it seemed like the skin on his neck and face was beginning to turn black. After a few moments, Randall turned to the forest and began walking, almost as if he were in a trance. The figure turned to my tent, and I focused my attention on it. The long white beak that protruded out from the hood around its head was iconic. It was something so strange and yet so familiar at the same time. This person before me was in fact a plague doctor. The black glass that covered the eyes shimmered in the faint starlight. Despite its connection to medical practices, I felt nothing but dread when looking upon this form. Before it could reach out to me, I grabbed my journal and I ran out of there as fast as I could. August 7th, 1972. This might very well be my last entry. I've tried my best to escape the mysterious figure that has taken my team from me. I have no theories as to its purpose or how it's doing what it's doing. It seems every time I stop to take a breath, I can see it steadily closing the distance. I'm going to hide this journal somewhere. Hopefully someone will find it and will be able to flee before it's too late. I guess now all I can do is pray it'll all be over quickly. That was the last entry in the journal. There were more in between the logs, but those had become illegible due to weather damage. I'm not sure who or what this ominous plague doctor could be, but if these entries are to be believed, then it's probably best to stay away from the forests of the Pacific Northwest. Who knows? It might still be out there, looking for people to venture into those woods, never to be seen or heard from again. When I was a kid, my favorite time of the year had to be winter. There was just something about all the festivities that gave me a sense of wonder. It might sound a little cliched or possibly a little cringy, but to me as a kid, the holidays felt magical. I would spend my winters watching my family put up all sorts of decorations around the house. Wreaths, lights, ribbons, mistletoe, and I can't forget about the star attraction, the Christmas tree. My father and I had this yearly tradition. We'd venture out to our local tree farm and he'd let me run around and select our very own Christmas tree. It was one of the few times that my father and I had a chance to bond. He would tell me all these stories about his past and how his father would take him to go get Christmas trees when he was younger. Although my father wasn't one to show emotion, I could tell that those trips meant the world to him. As the years progressed, my love for the holidays diminished. I suppose that's something that just happens over the years. People get older, develop new interests and responsibilities. During high school, I honestly couldn't care less about Christmas. To me, it was starting to just become another day. Another pointless get-together with people whom I barely remembered. Maybe it was those rebellious teenage years, but I just couldn't see the point anymore. That was probably the reason my parents stopped putting in as much effort as they used to. Eventually, my father stopped offering to go Christmas tree shopping with me and the holiday just sort of fell by the wayside. During my senior year in high school is when I met Sarah. She was incredible, and we instantly hit it off. A few months after meeting, we began dating. Early into our relationship, I realized fairly quickly that her family took the holidays very seriously. Sarah often apologized for her eccentric family, but I found it endearing. Every year, I was in awe of their decorations and the admiration they had for the holiday. It was honestly like something out of a Christmas movie. As time went by, Sarah and I both moved in together. We had lived in multiple apartments over the years until eventually we had saved up enough money to buy a house in the suburbs. As the year started drawing to a close and the winter holidays were fast approaching, I wanted to try and rekindle my old childhood love for Christmas. Once December rolled around, we went out and I bought a ton of decorations. We filled up the house from wall to wall with various festive items. Wreaths in every size hung in our windows and on our doors. Lights had been strung up around the exterior of the house. Tinsel lined our hallways. It was probably a bit much, but I still had fun putting the decorations up. Sarah and I had discussed about what we were going to do about the Christmas tree. She offered to go buy a synthetic one at a store somewhere, but I told her I had a better idea. I explained to her about a week in that my father used to take me tree shopping and told her it used to be my favorite part of the holiday. Without missing a beat, she asked me when I wanted to go. We made plans to go shopping for one at the end of the week. And I'll be honest, knowing that made me feel a happiness I hadn't felt in years. Friday had arrived, and after getting home from work, Sarah asked me if I still wanted to go. I nodded, and with a smile, she grabbed her coat. We headed back out into the winter air and hopped into my truck. We drove for hours trying to find a decent tree farm. A few of them had already been sold out, which was quite shocking to me, honestly. And others, well, their selection didn't look too great as we drove by. Then, after driving for nearly 45 minutes, we found a place. As we pulled into the lot, my truck's tires struggled to get any traction in the snow. After 5 minutes, we eventually parked and hopped outside. Our shoes crunched into the freshly fallen snow and we walked up to the gate. The trees that stood before us seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. Sitting off to the side was an older man who seemed to be reading a book by a portable heater. Sarah and I walked over to him and he struggled to peel his eyes away from his book. In an effort to be funny, I asked if he had any trees for sale, but the look he gave me over the edge of his book didn't seem to be amused. With a heavy sigh, he rested his book in his lap and pointed out to the trees. He said, "Find one you like and come let me know and I'll get it for you." I gave him a passing thanks and entered through the gate, with Sarah following closely behind. As we entered the forest, we both stared in wonder at all the options. Sarah quickly called me over and asked if this tree would be good. The tree was much too tall to fit into our house. It was a great tree, but much too large for our living room, let alone our doorway. We continued walking, looking around for that perfect tree. After a while, I realized I could no longer see the light from the entrance. The shift in atmosphere was chilling. The warm glow of the light bulbs had been replaced by the cold moonlight overhead. Sarah rubbed her arms in an effort to stay warm. I was beginning to realize that we needed to decide on a tree quickly before one of us freezes out here. Then we saw it. The perfect tree only a few yards ahead of us. I grinned as we steadily approached. As I was getting closer and closer, I heard Sarah whisper for me to stop. My feet halted in place, and I turned back to look at her to see what was wrong. Sarah was staring off into the distance. Her face was paler than I had ever seen before. I asked her what was wrong, but she didn't answer. She just stared. I followed her gaze and saw what she was looking at. Between a few trees off in the distance, two eyes were looking right back at us. The shadows cast by the trees around it was obscuring its body, but its eyes seemed to pierce through the darkness. I looked back to Sarah and she managed to whisper saying that we should probably leave. I turned back to look at the eyes in the darkness. They were still there, still wide, and still staring directly at us. Then, the eyes began to move out from the trees. As they did, they started to rise higher and higher above the ground. After a few seconds, the eyes were nearly half as tall as the tree it stood next to. It stepped out into the moonlight, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Its body was unlike anything I had ever seen before. It looked like some kind of mythical beast. Dark fur covered it from its head to its toes. Massive clawed hand gripped the tree next to it, and I could see the tree strain from the pressure. Large horns protruded out from its head, curling up and back from its body. It exhaled a deep breath through its nostrils. The gust of warm air visibly obscured its face for a moment. It took another step closer. The twigs beneath its feet crunched loudly. As it approached, I could see its face a bit better. A dark liquid dripped from its lower jaw, staining the pure white snow beneath it. Sarah took a step back, and I could hear a twig snap below her foot. I turned my attention to her, and she was nearly crying at this point. That twig snapping was like a trigger. The creature roared, and this drew my attention back. It then began running at us, but it wasn't running like an animal. It was running like a person. Seeing this, my eyes went wide with panic, and I turned to Sarah, yelling at her to run. We both began sprinting through the snow, dodging the numerous trees as they passed us by. Although we were both running as hard as we could, I could still hear that thing's footfalls growing closer and closer to us. Then, the sound of splintering wood echoed from behind us. I turned just in time to see a massive tree falling towards us with immense speed. I called out to Sarah to look out, and she darted away from it, while I did the same. The tree impacted the ground and it shook the earth beneath my feet. I called for Sarah, asking if she was all right, and for a moment there was no answer. I called again and I heard a response. I ran around the fallen tree and found her sitting near another tree. I held out my hand and helped her up. We both heard another loud shriek coming from deep in the woods. We looked to one another before running out of the forest back into the light of the entrance. The old man looked up from his book and asked us if we found one we liked, but we paid him little mind as we ran out of the fence, hopped into my truck, and drove away. There are a lot of things in this world that I can't explain, and that night is at the very top of this list. I have no idea what that thing was. Maybe some of you out there might have a faint idea, but I'm at a loss. I still love the holidays and Christmas, but this year, I think I'm just going to buy an artificial Christmas tree. And I would advise all of you to do the same. Christmas, or really any winter holiday for that matter, is supposed to be a happy time for children. You wait all year long. The weather slowly shifts away from the summer into the dazzling colors of autumn. Then, the serene yet unforgiving winter. You begin to count the days right up until the holiday, with thoughts of gifts rushing through your mind. For the majority of my adolescence, Christmas held a very special place in my heart. Well, it still does, but now for a much different reason. Year after year, I'd run around in the snow and watch my father put up all sorts of lights around the house. It usually took him a few days to complete, but once it was finished, the sight was astonishing. I'd often help my mother decorate the house. We'd put up numerous wreaths and ribbons along each door and window. Despite it being so cold outside, the decorations seemed to bring in a warmth all on their own. The tree was the final piece to the puzzle, the culmination of all the decorations. I'd carefully hang glass ornaments from the slightly wavering branches and watch as the lights of the room would reflect off of them. The tree would then be strung up with lights, and my mother would quickly shut off all the lights in the house before illuminating the tree. There was just something about seeing a brightly colored Christmas tree that put a smile on my face. The day would inevitably arrive, and I would wake up as early as possible so I could rush down to my presents. Of course, there would be presents underneath the tree leading up to the day itself, but seeing the new packages seemingly brought by Santa made me even more excited. My parents would sluggishly pull themselves out of bed and watch as I tore through multicolored wrapping paper, rip open boxes, and throw out handfuls of packing peanuts. For the first decade of my life, this is how I spent every Christmas. Then, on my 13th birthday, that all changed. The year hadn't gotten off to a great start. My father had injured his back at work in early February, and he had been out of commission for nearly 4 months. Although he was receiving compensation for his injury, it wasn't a whole lot to sustain our family. That, coupled with the mounting medical cost, was stretching our budget rather thin. My mother had to pick up a second job just to cover our basic needs. Thankfully, my father ended up being all right, and he had recovered nicely. He resumed working about halfway through summer. As August rolled around, my mother was able to drop her second job, but still needed to work a lot of hours to make up the difference. As November was fast approaching, I had become accustomed to spending nights alone. At the beginning of their new work shifts, they had tried to hire a babysitter for me, but were unable to find a good one. After realizing I was more than capable of not burning the house down, they left me to my own devices. That being said, I wasn't left home alone for entire days at a time. Both my parents worked the night shift, so I pretty much just spent the nights alone. December had arrived, and with how overworked my parents were, they were left with little energy to decorate our home. It seemed as if our house was the only one on the block that had no lights on outside. I did wake up one morning a few days into December to see our Christmas tree standing tall in our living room. While I understood why my parents couldn't decorate this year, seeing the tree was a surprising yet welcome sight. As the days continued, my parents began to pick up more and more hours at work. They began going into work earlier and coming home later. By the end of the first week, I was spending most of my days home alone. At first, I thought it was awesome to be by myself. I was king of the proverbial castle. Then, after a week of it, the exhilaration steadily wore off, and the daunting isolation became apparent. Although I was quite familiar with my home, lying in bed at night with no other soul present was unnerving. The atmosphere would shift as the sun fell from the sky. The previously bright and snowy day would turn into a desolate, frigid darkness. The nights wouldn't have been that bad if it wasn't for the noises that seemed to appear out of nowhere. They started roughly at the beginning of December. They were subtle at first, quietly echoing down my darkened hallways while I tried to sleep. It's difficult to describe exactly what they sounded like. It was almost like a blind man with asthma was wandering around my house. A mix of deep wheezing hisses and rhythmic thuds against the walls outside my bedroom door. After hearing these noises the first time, I asked my parents if they had ever heard it. My parents both glanced to one another before shaking their heads. My father told me it was probably the house settling. Older homes are prone to all sorts of noises. Furnaces kicking on, foundations shifting slightly. Any number of things could cause it. He assured me, though, that it was nothing to worry about. Despite his explanation, it did little to deter my uneasiness. The sound made me very nervous, but I didn't want to add to my parents' stress by worrying them, so I kept my concerns to myself. Nearly a week after asking my parents about the noises, something happened. As I sat in my bedroom playing a video game, I glanced out of my window to see my father getting into his car for work. The exhaust from his car clouded up the driveway, and after a minute, he was gone. Roughly an hour or so later, my mother opened my door to tell me she was heading off to work as well, and for me to behave myself. I returned a nod to her as she put on her jacket. A few minutes later, the garage opened, and my mother backed her car out and then drove away. Another night alone, I thought as I glanced out of the window a moment longer before returning to my game. Slowly, the sky changed from a bright blue to a pastel pink. The sun was dipping below the horizon. It wasn't much longer until the sky was black with a few stars peeking through the clouds above. It wasn't much later until I started to hear those subtle noises again. The thumps and taps off the walls. The gasping, ragged breaths. My brain tried to cling onto my father's explanation, but I had never heard a house make these sounds before. I quickly shut off my game. I thought that if I was quiet enough, the sounds wouldn't be able to find me. I got into my bed, which sat in the corner of my room away from the door. I pulled the blanket up onto my shoulders and waited, listening. The sounds grew and grew in volume, drawing closer and closer to my door. Like all the previous nights, they seemed to stop just outside. I shut my eyes in a childish attempt to wish away my fear. When I finally opened them, my eyes darted to my bedroom door. I could feel the color drain from my face as I saw that my bedroom door had been cracked open. In the dark space between my door and the frame was a face. Two glassy eyes stared at me. They had a crazed, wild look about them. The skin was pale but appeared to be covered in some sort of grime. After nearly a minute of staring, the mouth below the eyes split open, revealing a rotten, grotesque smile. I felt my body become stiff with fear. I wanted to shut my eyes tightly again and pray that it was just a bad dream, that I wasn't actually seeing anyone outside my door, but I didn't dare close my eyes. I struggled to keep from blinking as this thing stared back at me. Then, the door began to creak open a bit further. It started to push its head further into my room. Long, matted hair clung to its scalp. The hair dangled in front of its face. Patchy hair peppered its lower jaw as its head was now fully in my bedroom. I screamed. I screamed so hard I thought the windows would shatter under the resonance. The head instantly withdrew, and my bedroom door shut. I ran over to my window, threw it open, and climbed outside. Thankfully, I was on the first floor, so the drop wasn't dangerous. I dashed through the snow to my neighbor's house and pounded firmly on the door until someone answered. Mrs. Morgan answered the door. She had lived next to us for quite a few years and was friends with my mother. She saw my panicked expression and asked me what was wrong. I told her. I saw someone inside my house. She did her best to calm me down and called my parents. An hour or so later, my mother arrived to get me. She was upset that I had caused all this trouble, but that was until we began to walk back to our house. As we approached, my mom scolded me for leaving the front door open. I froze in my tracks and refused to move. I told her that I had jumped out of my bedroom window, that I never touched the front door. It was at that moment that I think my mom started to believe me. She promptly called the police, and after a short while, 2 cars showed up. The police searched our house and found something unsettling. Someone had been living in our attic. There was a space in our attic behind a few boxes that had been made into a small living area. Newspapers lined a makeshift bed, and various rotten food items had been left about. The officers questioned me, and I described the man as best I could. About a half hour later, the police knocked on our door. My mother called me over, and the police said they had someone in custody. They wanted me to see if I could identify the man. They stood him in the street with a bright light in his eyes. Those same crazed eyes and matted hair. Although I knew he couldn't see me, he still turned and flashed a rotten, toothy grin in our direction. I told the officer that, yes, he was the one I saw in my bedroom. They thanked me and my mother, made some calls on their radios, and left. Ever since that day, and every winter since, I have made sure to triple check all of the locks on my doors and windows in my house. While I am an adult now, I still can't help but feel a chill run down my spine whenever December rolls around. And it's not just because of the cold weather outside. Christmas is a time for family and friends to get together to share in the many traditions synonymous with the holiday. Visiting incorrigible relatives, partaking in the vast array of foods laid out on the table, decorating the Christmas tree. But none of the aforementioned activities are as widely regarded, I think, as the act of giving gifts. The winter holidays are supposed to be a time where people become selfless, where they give without the expectation of receiving. A time to bring joy to others through materialistic kindness. This was always my favorite part of the holiday personally. Some people may not feel the same, but I love giving and receiving gifts. Growing up, every single Christmas was filled with the anticipation, the rush of waking up and realizing the day had finally arrived. I'd run downstairs and gaze upon the collection of boxes arranged in a chaotic yet visually appealing pile. My family had a rule on Christmas that no one was allowed to open any presents until everyone was awake. I hated this rule, and I believe my mother knew this as well. So she said that if I wake up first, I'd be allowed to go through my Christmas stocking instead. That was always my first target when I tiptoed down the stairs. I'd find the stocking with my name on it and pull out all the contents. Then I'd spend the next 15 or 20 minutes stuffing my face with all the chocolates and candies contained within, until my stomach began to ache. Then I'd spend the remainder of the time playing with whatever game or toy was placed in the stocking as well. That was usually long enough for my parents to wake up, and I'd finally be able to tear into the meat of my presents. My love for gifts never really diminished as I got older. In my early teenage years, I still wasn't able to purchase any gifts of my own, but that quickly changed once I started working. The years that followed, I'd save up as much money as I could to purchase something for each member of my family. While it's true that receiving gifts is fun and exciting, you get a different kind of enjoyment out of giving gifts as well. To see the faces of family and friends light up when they unwrap their presents is incredible. As the years passed, I had gotten a much better job after high school. This allowed me to move out of my parents' house into a place of my own. Living on your own can bring about many challenges and responsibilities. As a result, I had unintentionally drifted away from my family. Work seemed to drain the time away like a vampire. However, I always managed to make it home for Christmas year after year. Until last year, that is. I had been working tirelessly right up until the snow began to fall. I was eagerly awaiting my Christmas vacation so I could spend my time with my family. However, in the weeks leading up, my boss came to me and told me that I needed to work on Christmas Day. Hearing that, my heart sank, but it was just another reminder that you have to make sacrifices as an adult. Despite having to work, I still managed to decorate my house and put up my Christmas tree. After telling my parents the bad news, they stopped by during one of my days off early in the month and brought me some presents. I thanked them for the gifts and placed them underneath my tree. They told me I could open them right then, but I decided to wait until Christmas Day instead. The days closed in, and before I knew it, Christmas had arrived. I got out of bed, got dressed, and was getting ready to leave for work. I smiled at my Christmas tree beforehand and looked down at the presents strewn beneath it. I left for work and spent the day somberly typing away at my keyboard. When my shift was over, I went home and walked through the door. I tossed my jacket onto the couch and walked over to my Christmas tree. I quickly began to tear through all my presents my parents had gotten me. A pair of socks, a new desk lamp, some video games, a couple household appliances. Each gift made a smile crawl on my face when I opened them. Then, at the end of my presents, I noticed one last box had been tucked far back behind my tree. I glanced at it curiously, as I didn't remember placing a box there. I retrieved it and examined it closely. The box was small and was wrapped in a plain red wrapping paper. It had no identifying marks on it whatsoever. There wasn't even a tag saying who it was from. I thought it was just another box my parents had given me that I must have absent-mindedly tossed under the tree. I tore off the wrapping paper and peeled the box open. What I found inside wasn't what I expected. Inside the box was a small USB drive. There wasn't any packaging, just a loose thumb drive. I took it out and looked it over. There didn't seem to be anything odd about it. After putting everything else aside, I walked into my small office and turned on my computer. I was beginning to think that my parents had made some type of home movies or perhaps gave me some old photos. I plugged in the drive and opened it. There was only a single folder on that drive that was aptly titled My Name. I clicked on it and the new window was flooded with photos. Hundreds of photos. Thousands of photos. They all appeared to be from different locations. I clicked on the first one. It was a photo of a small boy playing outside. I immediately recognized the kid. It was me. So they were old photos, I thought. I clicked on a few more and I started to notice something was getting progressively stranger about the photos. They would always be from a distance and most of them had been taken outside. After scanning through a few, I began to notice more and more photos of my family as well. Pictures of me and my parents at the park. Photos of us walking our dog through the neighborhood. Every single image brought an increasing feeling of dread. Some of the pictures were of me playing outside in the snow. The photos taken of me were starting to get eerily close, yet I couldn't remember anyone other than my parents taking my picture. I could feel my hand shake nervously over my mouse and keyboard. As I scrolled, I pulled out my phone and called my parents. I thanked them for the Christmas gifts and asked them if they had also given me a USB drive with photos on it. Much to my dismay, they had no idea what I was talking about. As I was growing closer and closer to the end of the photos, I noticed that I was beginning to age rapidly in them. Photos of me walking home from high school, me standing outside on my break from work, pictures taken of me in my bedroom, from outside of the window of my parents' house. I had no idea who could have taken these pictures. Then, at the very end, I saw that one of the photos was actually a video. I clicked play and watched. The staticky screen crackled and popped for a few seconds. Then the image appeared. It was a recording of my house that I'm currently living in. Seeing this image made my heart sink in my chest. The camera drew closer and closer to the window. I was busy decorating the tree inside. The camera did this eerie thing where once it found me, it instantly stopped swaying, like it had been mounted to a tripod or something. What's even more strange was that this camera filmed me for nearly 45 minutes straight. I had even glanced out of the window a few times, but I still don't recall seeing anyone at all. I eventually finished decorating and left the living room. The camera faded to black. Then, a moment later, through the darkened screen, I could hear a shuffling sound. The camera crackled a bit, and some shapes began to fade into view. The camera was now standing in a dark room. Seeing the layout, my skin turned a pale white. This person was inside my house. The camera walked over to my bedroom door, opened it, and walked inside. They stood directly over me with the camera as I slept. The camera stood there for the entire duration of the night. Then, about a half hour before my alarm went off, the camera lifted up and faded to black. I felt confused and nauseous after watching that video. I immediately called the police and they sent some officers over. I explained to the officers what I had found and I showed them. They took the USB drive for forensic testing, but they said that they probably weren't going to find anything. The officers advised me to invest in a decent security system, which was already crossing my mind. I thanked the officers for their help, and they told me that if anything else happens to call them immediately. I nodded and they left. I have no idea who could have been taking photos of me or for what purpose. What really freaks me out though, were the photos of me clearly looking towards the camera, both in numerous pictures as well as that video. I've looked directly at the person recording me, and I still don't remember seeing anybody. Christmas is supposed to be a happy time for people to share gifts with one another. But last Christmas was the very first Christmas. I wish I hadn't received any gifts. The reason I'm telling you all this story is because yesterday when I got home from my parents' house for the holiday, I found another small box. It was wrapped in the same plain red wrapping paper and was the only package sitting underneath my Christmas tree. Since last Christmas, I had purchased a full security system, but no notifications went off the entire day. I have no idea how someone could have gotten past my security. I have no idea what could be inside that box. And at this point, I am far too terrified to find out.